everybody, and welcome to another board game discussion video. Today's topic is one that is inherent to pretty much every single board game in some way, shape, or form, and it's sort of a follow-up to a review that I did a few weeks ago where I talked about Dexter the board game. Today I'm going to be talking all about randomness. And the thing is that by and large in many games this is done by cards or dice. So whether you're drawing random cards or rolling dice and doing whatever the result says, many games, the vast majority of games, have some kind of randomness built into them. But the thing is that some games do it better than others. And what I wanted to do today is to talk about three different categories of this type of game. Where first I wanted to talk about games that are completely inherently random, where you really can't control much of anything and there's very little, if any, strategy involved. Games that are the opposite side of that coin, where it is pure strategy and there is no randomness whatsoever. And the last category being games that have built-in mechanics that mitigate the randomness that surround the rest of the game. So what you'll see is sort of a theme through this, where the first two categories, where you have pure randomness and pure strategy, really involve, at least for me, the mental aspect of the game. Whether it's you're negotiating with your opponent, or you're just sort of like staring them down and trying to figure out what's going on, what are they going to do next, really trying to strategize your own plan and the whole like plan 6 moves ahead or whatever it is, and that kind of thing. Whereas with the third category of mechanically reduced randomness or mechanically mitigated randomness, you see a lot more complex games. Like actual mechanics themselves become more complex so that you can have that mitigation. You can still have a great deal of strategy, you can still have a great deal of table talk and interaction, but they are not really inherent to my personal enjoyment for those games. But that said, obviously this is a category that can create a big divide within the community. Some people love randomness, other people loathe it. And I would love to hear what you guys have to say about it, whether you love it or loathe it, or if you want to see mechanics that mitigate it. Please let me know anything and everything in the comments below. What are your favorite games that are completely random, favorite completely strategic, all of that kind of stuff? I would love to hear about it. But that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with my individual sections, starting off with the sort of pure randomness games. And again, as I mentioned, most of randomness in board games are going to come from one of two sources, either cards and or dice. That's really what we see more often than not. And the first thing that I wanted to mention is the game that brought up this particular subject for me personally, which is Dexter, the board game. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth into how all of the games work, but I will say overall in Dexter we've got cards, we've got dice, and the problem is there is nothing to change anything about it, because in addition to those things we also have tools that are spread out all over the board, again completely randomly. We've got suspects that are spread out all over the board, again completely randomly. You are rolling by a die roll, which means that you might pass by what you need to get to, and all this kind of stuff. Essentially, every single aspect of this game is completely random, and you have no strategic recourse for fixing any of it. And this is the perfect example of bad randomness, bad pure randomness. There is good pure randomness that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Again, I mentioned the mental aspect, and the problem is that you can't beat this type of randomness with strategy. It just doesn't work because it doesn't exist in this game. Same thing with things like Sorry and Monopoly, or really any game where you have just a very simple roll and move. I mean, even in Talisman you have roll and move, but at least in that you're able to decide, which direction you go, and you're trying to collect cards and actually do things that can make a difference for a character. Whereas in this, it's just a set collection game essentially. And if you happen to miss one part of the set, you move past it and that's it. So it's very frustrating. One thing that I have never really discussed on my channel, but is really inherently random and also very popular in the gaming world, are just to use these things right here. These are just ordinary playing cards. And the fact is, again, that playing cards are extremely random. That is the entire point of them. That's why magicians use them. That's why we use them for poker or blackjack or pinochle or hearts or spades or whatever your game happens to be. We have a very simple, very good random source thing here where mathematicians have talked about it for centuries, talking about the randomness of these games. However, I love card games. I really do. I greatly enjoy them. I enjoy them more if I'm in a larger group, simply because, again, to mitigate inherent randomness and pure randomness, what I really need to have is some kind of strategy, some kind of thing that can happen within my own brain that can mitigate at least some of that randomness. In this case, take poker, for example. You can bluff, right? Blackjack, you can technically count cards, but we obviously don't really want to do that. With things like pinochle and spades and hearts or bridge, those are inherently really more strategic games because you have to make strategic decisions based off of the cards that you have and, depending on the type of game, what your partner is doing. But regardless of what type of game you are using these cards for, there will be something that allows you to have some kind of a strategic decision at the time of what's going on. And that's why I personally really enjoy them. I really love that aspect of it. And again, that is something that Dexter is desperately missing. There is nothing that I can do in my own mind to fix anything that is wrong with it, at least again in my opinion. Next up on this particular list is Munchkin, and by extension a lot of these sort of party games. So whether it's like Dixit, or We Didn't Play Test This, or Cards Against Humanity, or Apples to Apples, or Concept, or anything like this. Codenames is another great example. These are examples of games where they don't necessarily have an inherent strategy that can mitigate them and something that mentally doesn't happen, but at the same time, you have a lot of table interaction, and the whole point is you just have a fun, quirky, weird theme. And that's really what it boils down to, particularly with Munchkin. In this game, you've got doors, you've got treasures. You might get treasures that when you first get your initial hand, you might be able to defeat a level 10 monster right away, immediately, no matter what. Whereas everybody else might just have a bunch of random potions and +2s or whatever it happens to be. So you have a huge divide, or a huge potential divide, between players just coming straight out of the gate. It's not inherently bad. Randomness is not inherently a bad thing, but at the same time, the mitigation in this case comes from really the interaction around the table, and you're with fun people having a fun time playing a really weird, stupid game. Perfect example of that is Cards Against Humanity. It's a terrible game for horrible people. That is the tagline for the entire game. That is what they advertise themselves to be. And the fact is that it's true. I have never played a game of that where people are really genuinely playing to win, because more often than not, people just don't care because it's just fun. It's just ridiculous, stupid, quirky fun. And that's what I love about it. But again, randomness, inherent randomness, can be fun, it can be strategic. The problem is that you have to have those factors. Other good examples are things like Werewolf and the Resistance, and social deduction games like that, where the randomness comes simply from dealing out the cards. Everything else is all about the players. It's all about how you're interacting at the table and what you're doing. Spyfall is another wonderful example as well. Again, you've got randomness as far as how you're going to start, what you're going to be doing, but beyond that, it's all about you. It's all about the player, okay? So those are my examples for inherently random games. Again, we're talking about cards, we're talking about dice, we're talking about distribution of goods and all that kind of stuff. Lots and lots of games do that. Most games have some way of allowing you as a player to make decisions that help to mitigate that, and or, as I'll discuss later, games will have mitigating factors within their own mechanics that can help you fix them. That said, we're going to go to the other side of this particular coin, which is where we have very pure strategy. Most games like this are very abstract. So the idea of abstract games is that you have this pure strategy. You don't generally have a theme. You have very little, if any, hidden information and all this kind of stuff. It is all about you versus the other player. You're starting on a level playing field and you're just trying to build up from there. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is actually a derivative of one of the other ones I wanted to mention. The first one is Hive. Hive is a tremendously fun little two-player game that is actually based off of chess, which is the next game I'll be discussing. In this game, you've got little bugs represented by tiles that move in different ways, and you place them down at certain times, and the idea is that you're trying to surround your opponent's queen and essentially trap her. But the thing is, you can move them around, and they have, again, different movement, not movement values, but movement styles, movement rules, all that kind of thing. But again, each player has the same pieces. You've got different colors, but you have the exact same pieces. You are obeying the same rules. You don't have any weirdness like, you know, you have to touch your nose when you put down your ants or whatever it happens to be, or ridiculous things like that. It is very pure, very simple, very basic strategy. And one thing that I love about games like this, the abstract games, is these tend to be the simplest to learn, but the hardest to master. I know that's a very big cliche, but the fact is it's true. Because that is how they are designed. They are designed to be very simplistic, but inherently purely strategic. So you can always train your brain to do better and better and better as you go. And this is one of my personal favorites because you can play it with many, many different ages of kids and adults and all sorts of things, because the rules are very, very simple, and, you know, kids love bugs and all that kind of stuff. And it's just, it's unique in the sense that it builds off of its predecessor, or its sort of inspiration of chess, where you have very unique movement abilities, and you're able to like sort of hop onto other token or tiles and things of that nature and cover them up, and just, you know, things of that nature. And you have to think a lot more globally compared to some of the other games. And again, that's a case with most pure strategic abstract games. But moving right along is the one that I mentioned I would talk about next, which is going to be chess, right? So I've got my big fancy chessboard here. And in chess, again, the rules are extremely simple. You only have a handful of different types of pieces that have very clear movement capabilities. You have very specific rules about who can move, when they can move, how they can move, all of that kind of stuff. And the goal is very simple. You're trying to trap your opponent's king, and that's it. That is the only rule of chess. And, you know, this is a game where we have had written hundreds, probably thousands, if not 10,000s of books that are about how to play this game. This game is, I don't know if it's technically ancient, but I know it's many, many hundreds of years old. And it was originally built as a military strategy game, and to help military strategists and generals and things like that plan out how to move armies. And it became a little bit more derivative, but suffice to say, again, we are talking about very pure strategy. There's nothing hidden about it. You know what your opponents have. You know where they are. Your opponents know where you are and what you have. And it is simply a mind versus a mind. And one of the interesting things is, for this particular category of game where you have this pure abstracted strategy, I couldn't think of any games that didn't do it at least reasonably well. So another good example are things like Blocus and Cathedral. I have Cathedral, I don't have Blocus, but in those you've got individual little like shapes, kind of like Tetris blocks, and you're trying to fit them into a coordinate grid by fitting them to one another. And again, it's very much spatial reasoning. You know what your opponents are doing, and you can play it as responding to them, or you can play it a little bit more aggressively. So you can play it as a defensive move, you can play it as an offensive move. Same thing with chess, and again, same thing with Hive. You know, you have very distinct and unique strategies, overall strategies for how to play some of these games. The last one that I wanted to mention for this particular category is one that I don't own, which is Go. And Go, I know for certain, is actually technically ancient. This is an ancient game of territory control that just involves white and black stones. And that's it. You're just trying to surround areas with your stones. And this is an example, a very unique example of this type of game, I should say, because with all other abstract games, we have a lot of computers that can beat people in them. I believe it was IBM, I believe, that made the first computer that beat a grandmaster at chess back in like the 70s or something like that. You know, absolutely ridiculous. But it's only within the last year that it took Google to make a computer that was capable of beating a master at Go, simply because there are literally quintillions of possibilities for how a Go board can be finalized and end up being set up. And the problem is that up until this point, there was no computer that was able to actually work through all those. And Google's AI doesn't actually do that. It doesn't work through every single potential aspect. It eliminates the vast majority of them and only goes through, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's thousands or millions of potential possibilities, but essentially just says, if I do this, then what will be my what is the most likely way that'll let me win, essentially. It's an analytical machine. That's what it does. Same thing with IBM. Was it Deep Blue or something like that? I don't remember what it was called. But it did something similar, but chess is comparatively extremely simple because you have a lot more rules in terms of the pieces themselves and how they move and all that, whereas in Go, it's a completely open board until somebody puts down that first piece. And again, then you have quintillions of possibilities for how the board can end up. Again, are you going to play aggressively? Are you going to play defensively? Would you rather just wait for your opponent to make a mistake and then strike? All that kind of stuff. It is an incredibly fun game that is all about the player's brains. That is it. That is everything that is involved with those particular games. And that's why I love those inherent strategy games. And like I said, those first two categories, the first two sort of prongs, are both heavily based off of the mindfulness of the players. Whether it's randomness that you can somehow mitigate with your own mind through negotiating with other players or bluffing when you bet your chips during a poker match, whatever it happens to be, it's something that you as a player can do. Other games do that also have additional factors, but with these inherently random or inherently strategic games, it really boils down to the players. So the last category I wanted to talk about is one I've mentioned a few times, where you have mechanics that mitigate the randomness, at least in some way, shape, or form. And again, these tend to be a little bit more complex in terms of how you play them, although you can have simpler ones. For example, King of New York and or King of Tokyo. I have King of New York here. With these games, you're rolling dice, you're trying to take over, in this case, boroughs of New York. In King of Tokyo, you've got somebody in Tokyo and you can attack your fellow players. Everybody else is able to attack the person in the middle, and to do it, you're rolling dice. Again, inherently random, very, very random. You're rolling dice, and you can also draw power cards as well. But you have a great deal of strategy involved with it, and on top of that, there's a mechanic within this that acts similar to Yahtzee, where not only do you get multiple rolls to try to get what you want, but at the same time, you also need to have sort of sets in order to get whatever it is that you wanted to get. So you've got great randomness mitigation, and particularly for King of New York, you have more random aspects because you got little tiles that represent the military coming after you, but again, you have more mitigation as well at the same time, where you can control where you move a lot more efficiently, and you have a lot more options of where to go. So there's a lot more strategic decision making, but these games are really inherently quite simple. They are not too bad in that sense. We do have things that are a little bit more complex. One of my personal favorites is one that I hold up as a great example of worker placement games, which is Kingsburg. Kingsburg uses dice as workers in this particular case so that you can influence the king's court to get resources. And one thing I love about the mitigation for this is how you combine the dice and also how the turns get altered based off of the different dice. You also have the ability to add to your dice. So there's a building that allows you to go up or down by one. There are also individual little tokens you can get that immediately add to. In addition, if you're a little bit farther behind, then you can get an additional die so that you can get more influence on other people. If you roll lower totals, then you'll constantly be able to go first, so you can for sure get what you want. I mean, there's all sorts of great mitigation for it, but again, it is completely random because you are literally rolling dice, and that is how you get your resources, is by rolling dice. And the entire game is based off of it. But it does a wonderful job of mitigating some of the big issues that come along with that. On top of that, to forge around the expansion for this is a modular expansion, one of my favorite expansions incidentally, and it does a great job of adding more to the game without making it more complex, and also mitigating even more of the randomness that the base game had. Again, absolutely love it. Great, great example of this. Last but not least, I wanted to talk about a game that's a little bit more complex, which is Twilight Struggle. Now, when I say a little bit more, I mean quite a bit more. We've got Twilight Struggle, games like Risk, Axis and Allies, like these really gritty, tactical, card-playing, die-rolling, ridiculous games like this. And in this case, you've got a lot of randomness, you've got a lot of mitigation as well, because you have a lot of strategy. So you're rolling dice pretty constantly in Twilight Struggle, in Risk, in all of these types of games, but somehow there is a way to mitigate it. In the case of Twilight Struggle, you can have more influence at a particular location, you can play higher value cards in order to get a bigger bonus, you can go to places that are less defended, you know, all sorts of different things like that. Same thing in Risk as well. And you know, this is really where a lot of games sort of sit, and they have that nice little balance where you've got a decent amount of strategy that is mitigating these inherently random factors of what cards are you going to end up with, what character are you going to end up with, you know, what are your dice going to say, all of that kind of stuff. And a lot of games do it very, very well. And I love this type of game because I feel like I can make very good strategic decisions, but in the end it might be for naught. I might make an epic win, I might win on a long shot, but at the same time I might be, you know, the non-underdog, the overdog, I don't know if there's a term for it, but I might still lose. And the thing is, I am okay with that. And this category of game, I feel, is the one that has the most ability to be replayable and versatile, because it really does not feel like the same game twice. It honestly doesn't. Kingsburg does that to an extent, but it is just not as complex. It doesn't have as many moving parts. Think again about something like Twilight Imperium. Lots of randomness there. You've got your political cards, you've got, you know, what are your opponents going to pick for their particular roles, how are your battles going to go, are you going to be able to get that tech, all of that kind of stuff. Huge game, tons of randomness, ridiculous amount of randomness, but mitigated by a lot of factors. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Again, randomness is inherent to pretty much every single game on the planet, whether it's a hobby game or something that's a little bit more simplistic, and I am very curious what you guys have to say. As I mentioned, for me personally, these are the major three prongs, where you've got very, very random, with very few, if any, mitigating factors, very, very strategic with no randomness whatsoever, and then the guys that are in the middle, where you've got randomness, but you've got built-in mechanics that mitigate it. That, again, is my personal favorite, but I'm curious, what are your personal favorites? What are your favorite really random games? What are your favorite not random at all games? And what are your favorites in the middle ones? More importantly, what do you like to see more in games? What would you like to see more? And with that, thank you very much again for watching this. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.